In some ways, Scenes from a Marriage is a simple movie. If you have two friends and a camera and a few Volvos, you could make this. In other ways, it isn't a simple movie at all. If you're into serious, mature, psychological realism, this might be your favorite movie. There are few films that are more sober, few films with the same intimacy, intensity, subtlety. And unless your name is Ingmar Bergman, which probably it isn't, you've got very little chance in replicating Scenes from a Marriage. Your best bet is probably to get married and experience it yourself. This is an electrifying movie, a brutal movie to watch in some ways, but a movie where every scene is on par with the pinnacle, with the most tense scenes out of most drama films. I keep saying that this is a movie, but the dirty truth is that it was first a television miniseries that was later condensed into a film, which is what I watched. I'm not sure if many people would describe this movie as condensed, given that it is just shy of 3 hours long. I can't offer any comparisons to the series because I haven't seen it. This is one of several Bergman films that have kind of a similar format, though. Before we go any further, I want to give two disclaimers. First, I'm not an expert in Ingmar Bergman. This is the fifth or fourth film that I've seen of his, which might sound like a lot until you see just how many movies he's made. I've long considered Bergman to be a hole in my film knowledge, and I'm trying to mend that. But forgive any inaccuracies that might slip in regarding him or his sister, Ingrid. That's a joke. The second disclaimer is that this is a good movie. Why is that a disclaimer? Well, lately, I've been changing my film selection strategy slightly for the channel to focus more on good movies rather than interesting movies. This probably sounds like a great thing. Finally, I hear you saying. But the bad news is that good movies are often harder to review. If a movie makes a big impression on me, it can take way more than 1 week to sort through that. Let me start out by praising the film with a few more specifics and talking about the style. Then we'll get into how this movie is profoundly different from most other movies, why it has inspired so many other filmmakers, and why it's so compelling. As I mentioned, this is kind of a simple movie. Almost every scene contains just two characters, a husband and wife, Johan and Marianne, played by Erlend Josefsson and Liv Ullmann. B.B. Anderson is also in one part of the movie. These are common Bergman collaborators. The score for this movie was composed by nobody because there is no score, there's no music. The movie starts with very simple opening credits. It has some simple chapter titles. There's very little between the story and the audience. The cinematography isn't the highlight of this movie. There are one or two noticeably nice compositions, but mainly it's kind of in the background. The film has a square aspect ratio. The footage is a little grainy, and as much as I like this movie, it does show that it was made for television. This is probably one of the most minimalist movies I've ever seen. It is sparse. Nonetheless, Scenes from a Marriage is really dynamic and electrifying. It starts out with Johan and Marianne being interviewed by a magazine about their marriage, their successful marriage, where everything is great. Their marriage of 10 years. Given the rather depressing reputation the film has, you're likely to comb through every scene here in the beginning, looking for cracks, looking for reasons why this could end up being a sad movie. This opening scenes has a few interesting, somewhat formal dynamics. The magazine reporter brings along a photographer, and the movie seemingly opens from the perspective of this photographer's lens. Johan and Marianne are kind of consumed by the act of posing. It reminds me of the photography scenes in the movie Secrets and Lies. Mike Leigh film, if you like this movie, you'll like that movie. Strongly recommend. This opening is potentially some kind of meta comment about romantic media, but it's also a frame for the rest of the movie, a suggestion that we are going to get something else, not a posed portrait, but something else. There is artifice here, though. When I talk about this as a gruelingly realistic movie with minimal style, you might think that it's just going to be two people in a room talking, but that's not quite the case. This movie does have some cinematic structures in it, some frames. For instance, Marianne reads from her journal at one point. She recounts a dream at one point. Johan gives plenty of speeches. These structures create some tension. They build up to something. It's a little bit of context for why something might matter. And while these are, not wildly unrealistic moments, while people do things like this in real life, they are less naturalistic than other parts of the movie. They feel like moments from a movie, or really they feel like moments from a play. Now, many of these structures actually end up being subverted. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is when Marianne is reading her journal to Johann. You might say she's pouring her heart out, really digging deep into her life before she looks across to see that Johann has fallen asleep. It's a clarifying moment. From this description, maybe it just seems that Johann isn't committed, which is partly true, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Either way, it isn't quite the moral you might expect when Marianne pulls out her journal. This opening structure with the magazine is also subverted. It almost seems coy to start the movie this way. Coy to be discussing this great marriage. The next scene shows Marianne and Johann laughing with their friends at dinner about the article, which has now come out. We start to see some cracks in the relationship, but not the one between Johann and Marianne, but the one between their friends' marriage. So, here's another little hook, another suggestion of some sort of impending reversal. These are kind of subtle effects, but in these moments, Bergman seems to be in the room with you a little bit, offering some kind of sly comment or pushing the movie forward. There are mechanics in this movie, is what I'm trying to say here, I guess. It takes a long time for us to actually see Marianne and Johann alone. First they're interviewed, then they're with their friends, which is really another sort of performance. And you wonder what is going to happen when they are finally alone. Will they be nice to each other? Will they have a healthy relationship? Well, yeah, they seem to, actually. This movie is in some ways very unpredictable. It has big twists, which I'm not going to spoil because they snuck up on me, honestly. When you watch this movie, I think Bergman puts you exactly where he wants you. This movie is made up of chapters. Presumably each one is adapted from one of the 6 episodes of the original series. A lot of these chapters are basically one long scene. Like I said, in other movies, one of these scenes would be the pinnacle of the movie, would be the finale. But here, the whole thing is like that. Obviously, some people are going to be bored by this movie, but I find it hard to look away, and not just because I had to read the subtitles. Emotionally, this is an extremely involved film. It's a brutal film to watch. I wouldn't say that it's a tragedy, but there's a lot of vulnerability here. A lot of vulnerability. Making it through the whole thing in one sitting is not easy. Now, I will say briefly that I think the balance of the movie might have changed slightly since it was released. Johann spends a lot of time feeling ashamed of himself. For instance, this might rub you in the wrong way. I also wasn't quite sure what Marianne sees in him. Marianne's character is still nuanced, very powerful. Marianne is a divorce lawyer, by the way, and Johann is a psychologist. This feels like another slightly coy moment from Bergman. In theory, these two professionals should be experts on marriage and interpersonal relationships, but no. There is an interesting scene where Johann works with a longtime colleague, a woman he went to school with. He shares with her some poems that he hasn't shared with anyone else, not even Marianne. You might think, hey, that's a big red flag, and maybe it is, but like I said earlier, Bergman is very deliberate with what he reveals, and when Johann gives his colleague a test, he asks her to try an experiment he's been working on, where she attempts to draw precisely in the dark. She tries to trace some dot or something like that, and he films this with an infrared camera. So here's another camera showing up in the movie, this time one that is more perceptive than our eyes in a way, but perhaps Johann, in his scientific manner, is missing something out here, is too calculating or cutting or something. It turns out that this dot, this challenge, it's a bit of an optical illusion. It's very difficult to pinpoint the dot. I think illusion is one of the more subtle themes in this movie, the illusion in the magazine, the illusion presented to friends and family, also the illusions arising between husband and wife. Johann and Marianne at one point talk about how their friends don't have a common language. Interesting idea, the illusion that could arise between two people. There's a song by Jackson Browne called Fountain of Sorrow, which is one of my all-time favorite songs. And it has a line where he says, "What I was seeing wasn't what was happening at all." And this doesn't really sound that deep on its own, but I think there's a big idea here. The idea that you can be consumed in a story, that you can have a context in your life, live through things, have structures that are not really true. And I don't mean that in a misinformation sort of way, but just that you can be misled by things that are so intimate and personal. Misled by whom? Who knows? I mentioned family and kids in this movie. We never really see either one, despite how large a role they play. This is an interesting choice. Of course, I'm all for avoiding child actors, and I think there is something to how isolated Johan and Marianne are, even amongst family and friends. In a lot of stories about marriage, though, the children are a big emotional linchpin of the movie. What are we going to do about the kids? Oh, we got to stay together for the kids. Things like this. And that is not the case here, which is interesting. Maybe there's some slight cultural differences, given that this is a Swedish film. I think there are some things like that, but I'm not sure if the kids would fall into that category as well. The movie really is the story of Johan and Marianne. To stay focused on them, it goes through a few big jumps in time, skipping parts of the story where others might be involved. My biggest technical gripe about the film is probably that this passage of time doesn't come across as well as it could. If they didn't sort of somewhat conspicuously say how long has passed, you really wouldn't know. The makeup budget for aging the actors was not high in this film. The biggest thing that I noticed about this movie is probably that the plot and the emotions and the characters aren't really in sync. This might sound like a bad thing, but I think it's a virtue. In a lot of dramas, when something happens, the characters react to it. Seems simple enough. In a lot of movies, it's like a switch flipping. One character betrays another, and suddenly everything changes. This movie is not like that at all. It takes characters a long time to figure out how they feel about things. There are a number of big twists in the movie that seem like they would change everything, but the way that Marianne and Johan interact, the day-to-day things that need to be taken care of, they don't really change. Even as deeper emotions start to emerge, people sort of are stuck in certain patterns. They don't know how to react. Even as time passes, Johan and Marianne really struggle to make up their minds. At times, I think Bergman might even take it too far with just how indecisive Johan and Marianne are. There are scenes where they go back and forth on an outcome like 10 times. It's almost a Columbo effect here and there where, oh, just one more thing, and they just come back again and again. Maybe it oversteps the boundary a little bit here and there, but this is life, I guess. It isn't a chess match. It isn't a clockwork drama where one thing leads to another. This movie has a lot of emotions in it, sadness, anger, but the moments mainly defy categorization. It's hard the characters don't know exactly what they're experiencing, and it's hard to categorize as an audience really as anything other than turmoil, which is what this is all about, and confusion. So that's scenes from A Marriage. Like I said, still a movie I need to digest. This film doesn't have a ton of like formal style, so in some ways there's not tons to discuss. This isn't exactly a marriage counseling channel, so I'm not sure if digging into the content exactly makes sense. Hopefully you don't feel shortchanged by this so much shorter review. There's still some that I need to digest. But overall, this is a great movie. To be honest, I'm a sucker for psychological realism. It's probably my favorite genre, and I'd long thought that this movie would be kind of at the top of the mountain there. And in some ways, I think it is. I have slight apprehensions about what I would call somewhat classical structures that sneak into the Bergman films that I have seen, which, like I said, is not an exhaustive list, but the ones I have seen, like Autumn Sonata, do seem to have sort of classical things in them. And there are a couple speeches in this movie that teeter on the edge. I talked about how it has some hooks and some structures, some play-like moments. In some ways, those are slightly at odds for me with the so-called humanist virtues of the movie, although, like I said, I think that there's only moments that are like that. And other parts of the movie are truly about as intimate as you can get. Either way, I don't think this quite tops some of the films that I would previously say are King of the Hill in this genre for me, like A Brighter Summer Day or something like that. But no doubt this is a great movie. And I think the last thing I want to say is that you might be drawn to this movie or inclined to see it because of its reputation as a grim or tragic movie, but there is a lot more to it than that. This movie actually has resolutions, brighter resolutions than you might expect, and it has tenderness and intimacy and love that you might not expect. Kind of has it all. So that's Scenes from America.